And this goes back to my central thesis that I've been talking about in my presentation now for going on 2 years, that it is the most psychologically and emotionally vulnerable kids who are falling for this and are essentially being victimized by our system and put on a path that leads to permanent sterilization and possible irreversible damage to their body and changes that they can't come back from.
Human rights! Trans rights are 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 human rights! Jenn Smith, go home! Go home, Jenn Smith, go home! Go home! Go home, Jenn Smith, go home! Go home, Jenn Smith, go home! Jenn Smith, go home! Lock in, John. Jenn Smith, go home! Jenn Smith, go home! Go home, Jenn Smith!
All right.
Right here! Right here! They're here! They're here!
What?
Where you going?
Maybe we need to get the police.
Trans rights are human rights! Trans rights are human rights! Trans rights are human rights! Trans rights are human rights!
Guys!
Trans rights are human rights!
Guys, relax, you psychos!
Trans rights are human rights!
Relax, you psychos! Violence is not cool!
Trans rights are human rights! Trans rights are human rights!
So it looks like they found Jenn Smith. That's kind of like a mob, isn't it?
It kind of is, and the police are just like walking away. They're like, oh, he's good. He's all right.
See?
So they talk about transgender people and that when we were young, we didn't have support in place for transgender people. That almost sort of implies and supports this idea of being born that way trans. There's interesting studies and stuff, brain studies and stuff like that, but there's no proof that anybody's born transgender. My own understanding of my own development and the way that I sort of came into transgender identity, and this has been confirmed with my interactions with many other transgender people, is that transgender, what we'll call transgender people, are people who are behaving in a certain way, okay? And there will be different reasons for why they behave that way. In my case, as a child, I was vulnerable and I was looking for a new identity, right? So from my own personal experience, again, I entered the foster care system when I was very young, probably about 3 years old, and I got bumped through a lot of homes at a very young age. Like I said, I went through 6 homes altogether by the time I was emancipated. So I know what it's like to be a child in that situation. Like I had the double whammy, okay? So not every foster child went through what I went through, in the sense that I went through some of the typical foster child experiences in terms of like there were some abuse issues and stuff that happened, and just the sort of the trauma of constantly being ripped from one home to another. That does a number on your sense of identity, and also the sort of this looking around, seeing that everybody else has parents, right? Even in single parent homes, at least they've got one parent, right? And you have no parents, and you've got this sense of having been cast out into the world. Because I was an emotional child, and because I was the youngest and smallest in my class, I was also viciously bullied in schools. So I was getting like a double hit. So I was your ultimate child who had a sense of being rejected by the world, right? I began experimenting with what you'll call cross-gender expression when I was probably about 9 or 10 years old, and I was a foster child, and I'd gone through multiple different homes, and I was what you would call one of these very wounded children, and I had like enormous self-image and self-worth problems when I was a kid. Like, to look back into my mind when I was a child is, I would say, disturbing for me to do even to this day. So I began, I would say, experimenting with cross-gender behavior because I wasn't happy with myself, and because I had this super popular foster sister, and I wanted to, like, she had what I thought was a perfect life, right? She was super pretty and had all of these friends and stuff. So I began trying to sort of emulate that, and I became obsessed with it. Okay, but that was what I would call an obsession that came out of the psychological and emotional wounds I had suffered up to that point in my life. So I was looking for some new identity. Today they might say to me that I was a girl trapped in a boy's body. But I would say that, I wasn't a girl trapped in a boy's body crying out for my true identity. What I was a wounded child crying out for help. So I think that the wrong thing to do actually would have been to reinforce this, what was essentially an obsession for me when I was a child. Okay, because what would have happened, in my opinion, is it would have put me on a path towards using all of these toxic drugs now that they're giving to kids. So Soju 123 nurtures and supports this identity in kids, and so they would have taken me and nurtured that and supported that, and knowing how I was and how my mind worked as a child, I probably would have just fallen right into that. People have to understand that once you nurture that idea in a child, say a young boy, okay, a young boy says, okay, I'm a girl. You nurture that idea and you allow the child to begin expressing in that role. When a boy begins expressing as a girl, he's immediately going to be besieged by enormous social and psychological pressures to look the part. Okay, but you've got your DNA working against you. Okay, so what are you going to do? And that's why we see so many of these kids today going on to use, the Lupron, the puberty blockers, the synthetic hormones, and all this stuff. So I was affected by something in my environment that I locked in on. Okay, so there could be all kinds of different things that might trigger a kid in that way. And so when we look at the studies of transgender kids, what we'll find, for instance, is that autism rates are very high. Okay, and what we know about autistic kids is they do have this tendency to lock in on ideas and stuff, right? If we were to accept the idea that, for instance, you can be born that way transgender, you're just born transgender, there's nothing you can do about it. Well, if we were to accept that thesis, then what we should expect to see with transgender kids, for instance, would be the same general rates of autism in the transgender community as in the general community. Mm-hmm. Okay, so but what we see in the transgender community is not that. So the studies vary, but if we go to the low end, some studies have shown that transgender kids are in the range of 8% on the autism spectrum. At the low end, but there are studies that go up to as high as 45 and 55% of the kids that they looked at who are transgender were on the autism spectrum. So let's say it's somewhere in between, 30%. Okay, that number doesn't become startling until you understand autism rates in the general population, which are 1.7%. For it to be 30% in the transgender community, that's way out of whack. Okay, there's no way to explain that except for that these are vulnerable kids who are locking into this idea and basically being preyed upon either intentionally or unintentionally by an establishment that has been set up to nurture that obsession, right? And take them onto a road to these drugs and stuff. And people need to understand that some of these drugs, like the puberty blockers, are highly toxic, with very serious long-term implications, including permanent sterility and stuff, right? So Lupron, for instance, is used to chemically castrate sex offenders. It's highly toxic. It shuts down parts of the endocrine gland system. That's how powerful it is, okay? And what we're doing is we're taking these vulnerable kids and we're nurturing these ideas in them, even though it might just be like a passing obsession. And we have science that shows that if you don't reinforce these ideas in these kids, right, you just let them go through this phase, somewhere between 60 to 85% of these kids grow out of it. Whereas if you nurture them in this idea, the majority will stay with that transgender inclination, right? So it depends on how you handle them. But the difference, the important difference there is that if you don't nurture them, their bodies stay whole. Okay, they don't take all of these drugs and stuff, right? And so their options remain open. Whereas if you nurture that and they make that decision, they become locked in and they end up with these irreversible physical side effects like permanent sterility, right? That's a very serious life-altering consequence for identifying as transgender. And these kids are too young to be understanding the implications of doing that, right? So there's another study that sort of indicated that the transgender kids, and they looked at a fairly large sample size of transgender kids, and found that 52% of transgender kids had one or more DSM-listed psychiatric condition in addition to gender dysphoria. Okay, so again, these are kids with all of these emotional problems. And that's going to get us into my sort of recent discovery, which actually came to me courtesy of Dr. Wallace Wong, who is the leading gender psychologist in British Columbia who deals with the greatest number of transgender kids. That's his specialty. Okay, and he refers a lot of kids to the BC Children's Hospital. Recently, he gave a talk in which he revealed, and these numbers I'm going to give to people, we need to understand, are predicated on the assumption that what Wallace Wong has said is correct.
So in our gender health clinic, we started in 2010. So back then, we started with 4 clients at the ministry, but now we have more than 500 kids under just the ministry alone. If I'm talking about my private practice altogether, I see more than 1,000. 1,000. So that's quite significant now.
If we assume that what Wallace Wong has said is correct, and he is the leading gender psychologist in British Columbia, so we have a good reason to sort of trust that he's not just going to say this. Okay, so he said of his 1,000 child patients, half of them were from the Ministry of Child and Family Development. Okay, that means they're foster kids, they're orphans, or kids who are otherwise under the care of the government of British Columbia. So like I was when I was a child. Okay, now to understand that, you need to understand that in British Columbia, there's somewhere in the neighborhood of about 650,000 school-aged children. Okay, of those children, it's 6,500 who are under the ministry's care. Okay, so 1 in 100 are in the ministry's care. So right there, you already got an alarm bell. Okay, so why, if foster children comprise 1 in 100, are 50% of Wallace Wong's child patients from the ministry? Okay, that's an alarm bell right there. So when I heard this, when I heard him say this in this talk, I was alarmed. It's because that number leaped out at me, right? And I was like, okay, so there's no way that 50% of his patients should be from the ministry. That's crazy. This needs to be investigated. But nobody sort of followed up on that, right? And it just sort of was left hanging out there. So I decided to go out and crunch some of the numbers and try to figure out exactly what this all meant. And again, so let's start by understanding that recent estimates have said that about 1 in 200 kids in the general population are identifying as transgender. 1 in 200. So that's 1/2 of 1%. Okay, so it's a very reasonably small number, right? Now, if we look at just and this is where we're really beginning to get why I'm saying we need to have not only a provincial inquiry, but probably a national inquiry. But when you crunch those numbers, okay, so 500 of Wallace Wong's patients are from the ministry. The ministry has 6,500 kids in its care. So when you do the math there, what you discover is that 7.7% of all of the children in the ministry's care are identifying as transgender and under the care of one doctor. Just one doctor. There are other doctors out there, like any family physician can basically prescribe hormones or whatever to kids and stuff. But that's just one doctor. So it is not unreasonable for us to conclude that the numbers of foster children who are identifying as transgender might be as high as 1 in 10. Okay, when you compare that to 1 in 200 in the regular population, that is alarming. Okay, and this goes back to my central thesis that I've been talking about in my presentation now for going on 2 years, that it is the most psychologically and emotionally vulnerable kids who are falling for this and are essentially being victimized by our system and put on a path that leads to permanent sterilization and possible irreversible damage to their body and changes that they can't come back from. So this is an alarm bell, and my feeling here is that, and I've been trying, like I came here to Victoria to try to get some interest from our MLAs on this issue and point out the seriousness of this. And I've gone to our mainstream media, and I've sort of tried to give them the same alarm bells, but everybody's ignoring this, okay? But 1 in 10 compared to 1 in 200, that is deadly serious. We needed an immediate inquiry to make sure that we are not feeding these vulnerable kids into a pharmaceutical machine that is making billions of dollars on this. Okay, it gets even a little worse though when you consider the fact. Okay, so I said that 7.7% of kids are under the foster kids are under the care of one doctor. We're going to come back to that number again right now. 7.7% of all school-age children in British Columbia are Indigenous children. Okay, one of the things that's been pointed out for some time about the foster care system is that even though they only comprise 7.7% of the general population, 52.2% of foster children are Indigenous. Okay, so they're grossly overrepresented in the foster care system. So we don't know what the actual numbers are with Dr. Wallace Wong's in terms of these foster kids who are identifying as transgender, but it is reasonable to conclude that maybe half of those kids are Indigenous. Okay, so this is like a double whammy. I mean, these Indigenous kids have enough strikes against them as it is already without being sort of suckered into what I consider a serious and, like I say, potentially permanently life-altering choice and being sterilized again. Like, so are we going back to the time when the government was sterilizing Indigenous children? It's almost like that right now, okay? And there's another reason why we should be getting a provincial inquiry. And so I am today, and hopefully we can send this out to our government officials and send it out to the media. I'm calling on the Premier BC. I'm calling on the Minister of Child and Family Development. I'm calling on our Minister of Education. I'm calling on every politician who has a decent bone in their bodies, who cares about the well-being of our most vulnerable children, to call for an immediate inquiry into what is going on with not only our foster children, but all of our most vulnerable kids, including the autistic kids that I talked about. And it is also, I would say, reasonable to conclude that if this is what is going on in British Columbia, it's probably going on in Alberta, in Saskatchewan, in Ontario. So this is probably something that needs a national inquiry. And this is not something to be slighted and hand-waved away. When you look at these numbers, I don't see how any reasonable person can conclude anything other than we need to investigate this. And I personally think that I would like to be part of that inquiry only because I don't trust our government. Right? And I don't trust the people who have been manipulated by the pharmaceutical establishment. So I think they need to have a critical eye in there, and I would happily take part in any such inquiry.